Hello and welcome. I'm Ben Lowe from the University of Florida, and on behalf of my colleagues Glenn and Ramesh, thanks for joining us to discuss our study on the influence of evangelical religion and politics on climate change attitudes. We start by providing some context to the importance of understanding connections between American evangelicals and climate concerns. Then we'll offer an overview of our research questions, methods, and model before launching into our findings and concluding by discussing key implications. Evangelicals are one of the largest and most influential faith communities in the United States, with roughly 1/4 of all Americans currently identifying as evangelical Protestants. What does it mean to be an evangelical, though? As a diverse religious movement that spans numerous denominations, evangelicalism can be notoriously hard to define. From a theological lens, it has been famously described by Bebbington's quadrilateral as having 4 primary characteristics. First, conversionism, the belief that lives need to be transformed through a decision to be a follower of Jesus Christ. The second characteristic is biblicism, or a high regard for and obedience to the Bible. The third characteristic is crucicentrism, in other words, a focus on the sacrifice of Jesus Christ on the cross in order to save the world from sin and death. And fourth and finally, activism, or a drive to engage individuals and society with the gospel. From a political lens, however, white evangelicals in particular have become increasingly associated in recent decades with both conservative politics and the Republican Party, with about 80% of white evangelicals voting for Donald Trump in the 2016 election. Along these lines, numerous studies have also shown that white evangelicals tend to hold more negative attitudes toward climate and more broadly environmental concerns. But also, the last few decades have seen a growing movement among many evangelical Christians promoting environmental stewardship and conservation, including on issues of climate change. Given the reality of how many and influential evangelicals are, both in this country and around the world, it is important to better understand these complex relationships in order to more effectively mobilize around climate action. Our study seeks to address these 3 questions. First, does identifying as an evangelical Christian influence climate knowledge, belief, or risk perception? Based on the literature, we expect evangelical identification to be related to lower levels of these 3 climate variables. Second, does religiosity mediate the relationship between religious identification and the climate measures? And third, how does the relative influence of religion compare with the influence of political affiliation, which has been identified in most studies as being one of the strongest predictors of climate attitudes? Our data comes from a quantitative mail survey across the state of Florida, which resulted in a sample size of 315. Florida is a strategic state to explore these relationships in, given its high proportion of evangelical Christians, its political significance as a major swing state, and its vulnerability to climate impacts. We used SPSS and M+ to conduct our analysis, which included structural equation modeling. Missing values were handled using multiple imputation, and weights were calculated by age, education, sex, and race. Here's our conceptual model, which compares the relationships between evangelical identification, Republican identification, and 3 climate measures. It includes religiosity as a mediator between religious identity and the climate measures. The 3 climate measures that we test in this model are climate knowledge, belief that global warming is happening, and perceived level of risk from impacts. It's important to note that this is very much an exploratory model with variables that are still in the process of being understood. And here's what we found. Model fit indices are all pooled and are shown in the box at the bottom, and our measurement model is consistently strong and significant. The solid lines in this figure indicate significant direct relationships between variables, while dotted lines represent significant indirect relationships. There's a lot going on here, so feel free to pause the presentation as needed. We'll go more into depth on the results in following slides, but I'd like to flag a few things here. First, focusing on the knowledge variable, the greater one's knowledge of climate change, the more likely one thinks or believes that climate change is happening, and the more one perceives risks from climate change. This makes sense. But secondly, why isn't belief in climate change related to risk perception, as one might expect? Our results suggest that belief alone may not be enough to be worried or perceive risks. For example, one could believe that the climate is changing, but still also believe that God remains in control, and so there's nothing to be concerned about. Or one could believe that the climate is changing, but think that the impacts will not reach you in time or space, and so on. Thirdly, note that knowledge acts as a mediator between religiosity and both belief that climate change is happening, as well as risk perception. Okay, let's get into this a bit more. The significant results here are highlighted in yellow, beginning from the top. First, higher levels of climate knowledge are associated with higher levels of risk perception, while identifying as a Republican is associated with lower levels of risk perception. No surprises here. Second, the more religious evangelicals are, the lower their level of climate knowledge tends to be. We'll come back to this again in the discussion. Third, as we've already touched on, higher levels of climate knowledge are associated with higher levels of belief that the climate is changing, which also makes sense. And finally, evangelicals tend to have higher levels of religiosity than non-evangelicals and are more likely to identify as Republican, which is in line with the literature. Our model also identified some significant mediation effects. First, the negative relationship between religiosity and both belief and risk perception is mediated by knowledge. In other words, higher levels of religiosity are related to lower levels of knowledge, and thus lower levels of both belief and risk perception. Second, the negative relationship between evangelical identification and risk perception is mediated by both religiosity and knowledge. In other words, identifying as an evangelical is associated with higher levels of religiosity, which in turn leads to lower levels of knowledge and lower levels of risk perception. That was a lot, so here's a summary of our key findings. First, identifying as an evangelical is indirectly related to lower risk perceptions around climate change. Second, identifying as more actively religious is associated with having lower levels of climate knowledge, and as a result, lower levels of belief that climate change is happening or poses a risk or concern. Third, identifying as an evangelical, as well as identifying as a Republican, while correlated to each other, both have independent and negative effects on risk perception, with religious identification having an indirect effect and political identification having a direct effect. We'd like to highlight 3 implications from this study. First, other studies have shown that even after controlling for factors such as politics, education, or media consumption, there is still a significant association between evangelicalism and climate skepticism. Our study reinforces this. Second, our study further finds that this relationship between evangelical identification and climate measures is mediated by religiosity. We hypothesize that this may have to do with the influence of social and cultural norms and dynamics, which we would expect to be more influential among those who are more engaged in their faith tradition and community. In other words, among those who have higher levels of religiosity. For more on this, see Dr. Robin Globus Feldman's recent published study titled The Gospel of Climate Skepticism. Third, an interesting big picture question to explore then is whether reframing this issue using religious arguments or reasoning can potentially help overcome the political or partisan polarization around climate change. We can see this at play in the prominent example of Dr. Katharine Hayhoe, who is a leading climate scientist, communicator, and evangelical Christian. One final note. Early on in our analysis, we sought to include demographic variables like gender, race, and age. But given the modest sample size, we chose to focus in on a simpler model. That said, recent polling and news media reports suggest that generational shifts may be taking place around climate attitudes and engagement, including among conservatives and evangelicals. While we were not able to test this hypothesis in our present study, we did just complete a separate survey of over 1,500 Christian college students and expect to report on those findings in the months ahead. So stay tuned. We'd like to thank all those who supported this study and are very glad to take any of your questions and feedback.